All right, welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us. My name is Jasmine, and I'll be your moderator today for the William Leo Hansberry Society's Represent or Represent Museums and Access. Every year since 2022, in February, we hold an annual symposium or roundtable in honor of William Leo Hansberry's birthday. And each year there's a different theme. And today we have four speakers who are excited to talk with you about their recent projects involving museums, access, and African art and archaeological collections, whether that be access to historical archives for excavations in Egypt, or community archives at small museums, or access to new frameworks and narratives through gallery reinstallation projects. So we've got several different approaches to this theme of access to collections to celebrate Hansberry's pioneering work in challenging institutions to recognize Africa's deep histories, intellectual traditions, and global contributions. And ultimately, this conversation asks how museums shape the stories that are told and the histories that are made visible. and we hope you will join us in this conversation during the Q&A. So we will have four consecutive 10 to 15 minute presentations and then time for a Q&A at the end of the last presentation. Please feel free if you're on Zoom to enter questions into the Q&A box, and if you're on YouTube, you can enter questions into the chat feature. A quick thank you to all of the sponsors for today's event, all of which are listed on the event flyer, which you can find at hansberrysoc.org/events. There should be a link to that in the chat. You can also find the schedule of today's speakers and their presentation titles there as well. And then lastly, I just want to thank those behind the scenes running the Zoom and the YouTube, Jared Kohler, Deborah Hurd, and Solange Ashby. And with that, I will turn it over to Sydney to introduce our first speaker.
Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, everyone. I'm excited. I'm Sydney, and I'm excited to introduce our first speaker, who is also our lovely moderator, Ms. Jasmine Smith. So Jasmine Smith is a third-year PhD student at the Institute of Fine Arts, New York University. She received her MA from the Institute of Fine Arts and a master's in library science from the University of Michigan. Her research interests include expressions of artistic creativity and cultural entanglement in ancient Egyptian art, and the use of digital tools in art history. She is currently working on a dissertation prospectus that studies expressions of a religious entanglement in Egyptian art from the late period through antiquity. Jasmine, take it away.
Thank you, Sydney. I'm gonna try to share my screen here. Okay, can you see that, Sydney? Is it full screen?
Yep.
Okay, perfect. All right, so in 2024, I worked on a project at the Met in the medieval art department where the archive for the museum's late Roman and early Byzantine excavations at the Karga Oasis in Egypt are held in the Western Desert. The scope of the project involved reconciling spreadsheets of metadata related to the excavation photographs into one spreadsheet. And most of these photographs were already digitized, so all that was really keeping these images from being uploaded to the Met's website was this new spreadsheet that needed to be created, and that was my task. So basically, the metadata you see here, if you scroll below the images on the website, this is what you would see in all of this information. These fields here on the left is what I was working to compile. So I'll talk more about where this is on the website, but first, I wanted to give some brief background on the excavation. So the records for the Metz project and the Karga Oasis date from 1907 to 1989, with the bulk of that coming from the years 1907 to 1937. In 1907, the museum was granted a concession to excavate in the Karga Oasis, which included sites such as the Temple of Hippus, the Bhagawat necropolis, and other late Roman, early Byzantine structures. The Bhagawat necropolis in particular was a center for focus for the first season in 1908, which contains a largely Christian cemetery that was in use possibly as early as the second century through the 6th or 7th centuries AD. And the necropolis is known for its over 200 tomb chapels, several of which have facades decorated with arches, niches, and engaged columns like you see here. And a few are also well known for their decorated interiors that include painted narrative scenes featuring biblical figures and symbols. During this season in 1908, the team also excavated a mound known as Aina Turba, a few hundred meters south of Bagawat. And there they found mud brick houses, some of which had walls covered in white plaster and decorated with frescoes. So you can see one here with grapevine decoration to the left here, and then another one here that features a few possible figures of people. These houses also yielded small finds such as pottery, ostraca wooden tablets inscribed in Greek, glassware, faience, and so on. And during the third season, Herbert Winlock began clearing the Hibis Temple. That's dedicated to Amun-Re, Amun-Ra, and work there would continue into well into the 30s. These excavations are represented through various publications by museum staff, including Albert Lithgow, Marcia Hill, Charles Wilkinson, Herbert Winlock. They're also, of course, represented by the objects that were found that are in the Met's collection and at the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, as well as exhibitions at the Met, such as Art and Peoples of the Karga Oasis, which was on view a few years ago, and which featured some 30 works from the excavations. And then ultimately, the excavations are represented in the archival documentation that has been organized by museum staff, which is my focus today. So I'll briefly describe what these records look like and then go into my project and some of the takeaways or more so things that I'm thinking about regarding visibility and access. So the current archive is referred to as the records of the excavations of the late Roman and early Byzantine sites in the Karga Oasis. And the records that have been added to the Met's website can be found through the museum's Watson Library Digital Collections website. So these records are currently divided into four series, the first being correspondence mainly between museum staff and government officials, other Egyptologists. The second being excavation records and research, so like field notes, sketches, journals, things of that nature. The third, which is what I focused on, is photographs, and this includes photo boards, loose photos, and negatives. And then the fourth series, which includes oversized materials such as architectural plans, site plans, and drawings. A link to the finding aid for this collection is also on this webpage. And we're going to add, I think, links to both the finding aid and where you can find this page on the MAPS website in the chat if you want to check those out later. Um, okay, so the ultimate goal of the project that I worked on, I was brought in as an intern. The goal was to facilitate the online availability of photographs that had already been digitized, specifically these photo boards. So what you see here, there were about 7 boxes of these photo boards that were already digitized. Some of the boards contain one or two photos, like you see on this board, but some could hold up to 6. And then at the beginning of the project, the metadata for the photo boards lived in two separate spreadsheets. And select fields of data from these two spreadsheets needed to be essentially added to a new spreadsheet that would then represent the information you see here. Uh, so this is what you see when you're on the website and you scroll below one of the images of the photo boards. This is all the information for each one of these photo boards. So ultimately, the project involved a lot of metadata organization and cleanup, the creation of over 400 folders for photo boards. Each folder had to have its own or each photo board had to have its own folder, and then organizing nearly 1,000 images into these folders in order for the digitized images to be made available um, online by staff at the Watson Library. I'll just go back to this one so that you can see the images here. So this is the image of, in yellow, the full photo board. But then the two images below that are just individual images of what you see on the photo board. So all of these photos would have been included in their own folders, and then accompanied by the spreadsheet with the metadata. Okay, so there are 5 questions or considerations that I've been thinking about in relation to this project. and the theme of access that stemmed from a debate actually that broke out recently in an undergraduate class that I teach this semester called Making the Ancient Mediterranean. And so a few weeks ago, we were discussing the histories of museums and museum excavations in relation to colonial legacies and imperial agendas, particularly in the United States. And a question came up, which was, are museums centers or spaces for learning? Some students said no, museums are where people go to take selfies. Others argued that you'll probably walk out having learned something that you didn't know before if you read the labels. And others suggested that museums should be centers of learning, but that they often create barriers to accessing information. Now, it was very clear from the conversation that some students were familiar with like audio guides and tours as sources of accessing information from museums, but many, of course, were not aware and certainly not aware of online resources that museums provide, which has given me a lot to think about and certainly more questions than answers. But hopefully these can spark some discussion for the Q&A later. The first being, what is access? There's a common assumption that once material is made available online, that it's inherently accessible. But I think this can and has been problematized in library science literature. Material might be accessible depending on if you have an internet connection, a device that can connect to the internet and to a museum's website. But there are also other factors, such as the organization of information, that can help or hinder access. It's also easy for collections to be hidden under the layers of institutional structures. For example, the Karga excavations were under the Egypt expedition of the Egyptian Department of the Met, but these records mainly live now in the medieval art department. Most of them were transferred to medieval art from Egyptian art in 2000. And then the digitized records are found through the library's website. So you kind of have to know where to find the information, not just the information being accessible online. A second thought is, who is this for? Sawasa will be talking next about community archives, and that had me thinking about what might a community aspect look like in the case of these historical excavation records. Obviously, there's institutional history here, there's Egyptological history, archaeological history, all of which would be valuable to various research communities. Um, but I'm thinking more about how does the way in which institutions provide access or organize access to the material help or hinder the community that this labor is for? How often are we implementing ways to receive feedback from users to evaluate the usability, or does the consideration for users just end once the material is made available online? A third thing I've been thinking about is preservation and the act of digitization as preservation of historical documents and photographs, which is often the goal with digitization projects. But we can also think about how not only is the media being preserved here, but also early 20th century, late 19th century archaeological practice, especially with archival photographs. We're not just preserving records of a project, but these photos are preserving how excavations were conducted and the point of views or perspectives of those taking the photos. So these archives can tell us what was seen as valuable to photograph, but also what was not seen as valuable to photograph. They're a reminder that there was a person or people behind the camera making decisions that impact the record we have today. And this is just a reminder in general too that archaeological data collection is not neutral, and neither is the metadata that we use to describe it, which is kind of my next thought. I'm going to go past this one for now, though. A final thought or consideration I've been thinking about is that of priorities. I'm sure several of us have worked or are working at institutions with large backlogs Making collections available requires a lot of resources, in particular staff time and labor. So, for those institutions that have histories of being involved in these early excavations and who have amassed collections of historical records, there's a question of who decides whether making these records available at all are a priority and whether resources are allocated to the effort. Are these departmental priorities, institutional priorities? I have a lot of questions, so I'm going to leave it there. We can hopefully discuss more of these in the Q&A. But thank you, and I'm going to stop sharing and introduce our next speaker, who is Dr. Sawaso Asafa. Feel free to turn on your camera when you are available. Dr. Asafa is also working at the moment, so she's got a lot going on. Okay, so Swaso Asafa is a bioarchaeologist whose work integrates bioarchaeological and stable isotope analysis with archival research and oral histories to examine how communities experience socio-political and environmental change in East Africa and the US. She received her PhD from Washington University in St. Louis, and so also currently manages community archives and educational programming at the Griot Museum of Black History, where she has developed archival workflows and documentation protocols. And so I'm going to go ahead and invite Sawaso to join us if she can on camera. Um, and again, she's in the middle of something, so if she's not, I'm wondering if Miss Sydney Pickens would be interested in filling in for her until she gets to a point where she can join us. Okay, cool. Let me read your bio, Sydney. Sydney A. Pickens is an archaeologist, educator, dancer who is passionate about making archaeology accessible and exciting through embodied and experiential teaching and learning. She is currently a master's candidate in Egyptian art and archaeology at the University of Memphis. Her research interests are in the interplay between the body and written language, Nile Valley dance traditions, embodied knowledge, community-engaged archaeology, and bridging the gap between academia and public schooling. And so I will give you the floor. Take it away.
Thank you kindly, Jasmine. Again, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone from wherever you're watching from. Thank you for joining us today on this fourth annual celebration of William Leo Hansberry. And today I'll be approaching the subject of representing through the lens of a small reinstallation of Nubian objects I'm working on in the Institute of Egyptian Art and Archaeology collection housed in the Art Museum of the University of Memphis. Let me share, that would be helpful. Okay, so borrowing from the name of our event today, my talk is called Representing Nubian Objects in the IEAA Collection. Just as a bit of background, there are approximately 1,400 objects currently in the IEAA collection. And though few in number, the Nubian objects in the collection cover an expansive breadth of chronological periods, sites, materials, subject matter, and themes relating to ancient Nubian history and culture. What you're looking at here currently is the current Nubian display that we have on view. We just have the one case. here, as well as an uncased offering table from the Meroitic period. In this far right corner here, there used to be a stela, a Meroitic stela, from the Prince Caribun. He's currently on loan. He will be back. And when he gets back, he'll also be reintegrated back into this space. But right now, I'll just be talking about what we have currently on view. Okay, so the objects currently on display are grouped solely by their Nubian provenance. Its relatively uncritical grouping presents ancient Nubia as a monolith and highlights the disproportionate attention given to ancient Nubia in Egyptological spaces. A revised display is necessary to present viewers with the new perspectives on ancient Nubia that consider the nuances and diversities of ancient Nubia cultures and people, and also the African presence and role in shaping the ancient world and modernity. As part as of the last significant reinstall was about maybe 15 years ago or so. And so it was time to revisit this work. And as a part of my graduate work at U of M, I have had the privilege to be tasked with developing the new interpretive strategies and narratives for the Nubian objects in the collection. Just to give you a little bit of background or a little bit more framing, throughout this presentation, I'll be talking about how I'm thinking about representing these objects. And in order to do that, also showing you how they're currently being presented. The current, this is the main case for the Nubian objects currently. Like I mentioned, they're all grouped together, different time periods, different culture groups, all together. And then the narratives that are currently being presented are more Egypt leaning. So Nubia, the land of gold, to the ancient Egyptians lay south of Aswan, Egypt's southern boundary. Stability was brought to Egypt from Nubia at the end of the Third Intermediate Period. The kingdom of Napata borrowed many ideas about religion and kingship from Egypt. The first millennium BC, the people of Nubia followed many customs they adopted from ancient Egyptians. While well-meaning, the framing of these narratives very much put Nubia in a peripheral position. And what I'm thinking about and what scholars in Nubian studies have been thinking about for the past couple of decades or so have been thinking about how to reframe and recenter Nubian narratives within these kind of spaces. And so, like I said, it was overdue to do this for the IEA collection, and I was excited to come into this space and be able to reframe it to make it a more reflective of centering Nubian experiences. Okay, so while considering the roles and responsibilities of museums in caring for objects and providing access and preserving African heritage, one of the first thing that comes to my mind is the visitor, how the visitor is oriented in the space. This is a current introductory map that's in the gallery. And as a docent, I make it a point to begin my groups here, to give them a lay of the land, literally, and to understand how the geography played a significant role in the emergence and development of Nile Valley cultures. In particular, I highlight the topography of the Great Rift Valley, the highlands of Ethiopia versus like the lowlands of the Nile Delta, the torrential rains that cause the annual Nile inundation, et cetera, et cetera. Oh, the origins of the Nile River in Ethiopia and Uganda, et cetera, et cetera. While I talk about these things very avidly and I make a point to, these things are not represented on this map that we see here. And so as we're thinking about reinterpreting the objects that are in the museum, one of the first things I want to do is bring in an updated map so we can expand our vision of where we are in space, noting that we are on the African continent in Northeast Africa, and be able to show the interaction between Egypt and Nubia with the Mediterranean world, as well as West Africa, as well as going east as well. Another thing that's really important to us as being situated inside of Memphis is the fact that um, I I live in Memphis right now, and so Memphians have a natural kind of affinity and already understanding of ancient Egypt, but they don't have that same kind of connection to ancient Nubian history. And so, um, thinking about ancient Memphis as the original capital of um, Old Kingdom, this is also a great point to do to create a connection, a point of connection between the current population that is coming in and the ancient world as well. To be like, well, also the Kushite 25th dynasty also founded their capital at Memphis as well, and so creating um, introducing the ancient Nubians a little bit earlier into the space because you might not see it until you get in later, and engaging them in the conversation immediately. Another thing that I like to focus on also is or we want to focus on in the new install is looking at etymology and talking about how the term Nubia even came to existence, particularly like during the Meroitic period, and then shifting depending on the different ethnic groups and the languages. And now how so kind of a term that's a source of pride, you really need to think about how that term functions today and how it functioned in the past. And there's a lot of what I'm looking for. Parsing that out in this space, I think is really important to give people an understanding of the people and the cultures that we're talking about. The last thing I think is important for the reorientation is talking about chronology. I don't have a picture of it here actually, but so this is next to this wall. For the map, there's a chronology of ancient Egypt, but we do not have currently a chronology of ancient Nubia in the galleries. And I think it's really important that we add that in there as well. Historiography. Also setting the stage, I thought it was important to note the historiography of the region and create a space for comparison of how we think about Nubia today versus its disciplinary beginnings in the 18th and 19th centuries. I was really excited to find this map in the collections. It's currently not on display, and so we'll be bringing it out specifically for the reinstall. Um, and the map is exploring um, early European explorers' misconceptions about the Nile valleys, essentially south of Egypt. And so a lot of those early travels, were focused on a search for origins and empires and trying to find like states and also really looking for the source of the Nile River. And so what we're hoping to do is create some kind of like sight line between this map and the orienting map I just had on the screen to encourage conversation between like how our understanding of the region has shifted and evolved through the years. Excuse me. How it's evolved through the years. Um, and see how we're thinking about this space a bit differently. Yeah. Mhm. Another theme that one of the first themes that I'm exploring in the reinstall after kind of doing those orienting texts and ideas is looking at performing identity. I struggle with this section because I really wanted to highlight the nuance and diversity of Nubian ethnic and language groups through an indigenous Nubian lens, but the materials we have in the collection primarily come from Egypt. Um, and this is a very common issue that we have. And so I was confronted with, okay, how do I talk about self-representation when we don't necessarily have too many things that are offering self-representation? We do thankfully have these two pieces from later periods, which I'll talk about in a second. But first, I'm going to dive into these um, ideas of what Stuart Tyson Smith calls like the construction of like the Nubian ethnic identity or the foreigner topos used to establish social difference and maintain state ideology. And so we have these images from particularly the New Kingdom, which is this image here and this one here, two relief fragments of Nubian men. Um, showing the what looks like to be the like stereotypical representation of how Egyptians perceive Nubians. So with full lips, broad noses, fabulous big earrings, generally dark skin, and either like an interesting kind of cap or hat or possibly hair. And versus what you see when the ancient Nubians will represent themselves, particularly from the images we have later on during the Kushite, the Napatan periods, and the Meroitic periods, where you see the development of a very distinctive royal iconography and regalia. And so in this image here, hoping to frame it to talk about, this is a carabin sealer that I mentioned is currently on loan, but when he comes back, talking about how there's this mixture of identity here and the performance of identity that's happening, whereas you have a Nubian prince who is dressed in his Nubian attire, but adoring Egyptian gods, using Egyptian language, but this is probably written by a Nubian scribe. And so you have these, the current scholarship talks about entanglement of cultures, entanglement of ideas, and people coming together and mixing to create these new identities. That kind of performance is happening all in this object. And Sarah Schellinger talks about it also being a space to really explore the transmission of language and religion and literacy throughout the Nile Valley prior to the development of the Meroitic script. And so trying to figure out how I can pack all of that information in, but in a concise way, is always the hard part in a museum space. So pack it all in to really give visitors a more nuanced idea of like how these people were coming together and exchanging ideas, belief systems, identity politics within this space. What else would I like to share? Oh, and then similar thing, talking about identity performance with the Shabdi of Sin Kamen Skin. A later Napatan king who is still very generations after the Kushite kings have been expelled from Egypt and are still ruling from Napata, they still have that W race, or actually start the W race after Taharka, which I think is interesting. And so the development of this Kushite royal iconography and talking about how um, they are, yes, borrowing Egyptian motifs, but then changing them and innovatively working them for their own purposes to create their own kind of state ideology. And with the Shabti as well as the Stela, these are also great spaces to um, offer translations of the text in the museum space, which hasn't been done before in our museum. And we're looking to doing that with not just the Nubian objects, with all of the objects in the coming years for the new installations, because I think it's really important um, to explore and examine and interpret the text, because the text and the images and the objects work so closely together that they can't be separated. And without that extra information from the text, we're losing a lot of information about the objects that we have. One of I think, oh, the next theme that I'm exploring is the land of the bow. We know that Egypt was known as one of its many names was known as Ta Seti, the land of the bow, called that by the Egyptians. It at Memphis, the South in particular, is a particularly kind of spiritual or religious space, in the sense that there's a large Christian population, and we get a lot of Christian visitors and school groups coming to the museum. Not to say that's the only group that can like connect with this, but this is another point to connect, bringing in biblical scriptures. Kevin Burrell, another Hansberry Society member and a scholar of ancient Kush in the Bible, uh, talks about a large number of sightings of ancient Nubians or Kushites inside of the biblical text, particularly these two instances from Isaiah. Goes with messengers to a nation tall and smooth, To a people feared near and far, to a powerful and subjugating nation, whose land the rivers divide. That's Isaiah 18:12. I mean, sorry, 18:2. And now Sennacherib received a report that Taharka, the king of Cush, was marching out to fight against him. Isaiah 37:9. And so we are looking to have a Shabti of Taharka, and so we can contextualize and frame that Shabti, which currently doesn't have any interpretation with it, to talk about how Taharka was a part of this larger narrative of antiquity and connected to the Levant and these other areas, and really focus on the military prowess that we know to be true about ancient Nubians. Um, in this later period in the Kushite dynasty, as well as looking at this bronze dagger from Kerma, thousands of years before. And so talking about this continuity within the culture of having a reputation of being formidable warriors. We have a number of arrowheads. They're small, obviously a little bit on my side. They're super small, but they also lend to that story of this place being known um, for their archery skills, particularly because um, of the landscape that they lived in. So thinking about the folks who were living in the highlands, who were living in the deserts, where archery was a main artery for survival, for hunting and game, and so that then translating into their ability to understand how the land moves and understand how to navigate different spaces, and that being used into um, to support their military pursuits. And so trying to figure out ways to connect all of these narratives with the small amount of objects that I have, of building it out and using the objects themselves to tell the story. And then the last theme that I'm exploring is Nile Valley religion. This one is really focused on trying to remove that separation between Egypt and Nubia and focus in on the idea of it being a cultural continuum, and the connection between the two groups, um, and exploring the ways that material culture appears in both spaces, and that the motifs that we see are can't really be talked about in terms of origin, I like to think, but more so in just terms of like a continual back and forth and exchange and change and changing and evolving and things like that. Um, the paddle doll is one of my favorites. I think they are so ornately decorated and beautiful, but they speak to, according to like current scholarship, of the possibility of them representing Nubian women in the court of Mentuhotep the second at Del Bahri. So I want to highlight that. And then also possibility of like the checkered leather pattern on the outfits, talking about Nubian identity there, even though they're found in Egyptian context. Also, the tattoo of the tradition of tattooing being a very specific Nubian practice. However, the more figural ones I've been finding are more so found on Egyptian women. So then it kind of switches where the Nubian women have the diamonds. There's more so figural tattoos like this tarara on the back of this one on Egyptian figurines as well as on bodies, I believe. But yeah, what else? Oh, currently this paddle doll is like laying down, and so we're excited to sit her up so people can actually see the Torah on the back and get that full experience of the object. The ram headed amulet, talking about the possibility of it being a moon, and a moon with the ram head being a manifestation of a moon specific to Nubia that particularly happens during the New Kingdom, and that kind of um, uh, religious synthesis that happens, as well as the lion-headed amulet. I'm talking about the lion-headed god. Oh, I gotta go. A Betamok and sorry, a Betamok and Mahas, and then also this beautiful offering table of Nastasen, where you can talk about ritual libations, that being a very African and ancient practice among many cultures. And very quickly, very end, um, um, the overarching thing of this presentation and what I'm suggesting is a continual evolution. Revisit your collections, the narratives you're presenting, and the narratives you're presenting early and often. Ask yourselves if and how your exhibits reflect the current state of research and ethics. I know a lot of this are already doing this work, and what I presented here isn't anything new, but follows in the continuum of how I want and expect to see the presentation of African artifacts continually shift through time, and how I'm hoping to contribute to the process. Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Ms. Pickens, for that lovely presentation. Just a reminder, if you do have any questions on Zoom, please do feel free to put those in the Q&A. If you have any questions on YouTube, you can enter those in the chat. Okay, so I think Dr. Asafa is available. Awesome. Okay, I read your bio earlier, but I can read it again if you like.
No, I think it's okay if you read it earlier. That works for us.
All right, take it away.
All right. Are y'all able to see my screen?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay. Hi, everybody. I am Sawaso. I'm going to be talking about small museums and community archives, building multivocal histories. And I'm mainly going to be talking about my experience working at the Griot Museum of Black History here in St. Louis. And I'm going to be highlighting a little bit about the contribution of the global African diaspora from a local perspective, so local to St. Louis. And in doing so, my goal is to basically invite all of you to think more about small community museums as not a miniature version of larger institutions, but as fundamentally different models of knowledge creation, but also memory keeping. And so here is some picture, a major picture of kind of like an outlook of the archive as a whole. And just to give you a little bit background about the Griot Museum was founded in 1997 as the Black Wax World History Museum. We were not a collecting museum, but we started receiving a lot of donations from community members. So usually families will donate photographs, clothing, various documents, and personal objects that are tied to various memories, as well as the lived experience of their family members. So here, for example, we have a large collection from Mr. Percy Green, who is a civil rights activist who actually climbed the arch in St. Louis in the 1960s to protest Black people not being allowed to participate in the construction, but also in access to the arch in downtown St. Louis. And so his family and himself as well has been able to donate a lot of textual material, as well as tell us about his history and his experience as a civil rights activist during that time. Also, we have a large collection that was just donated to us in 2022, and we're working on inventorying and describing this material, and that is from the family of Alice Wyndham. Ms. Wyndham was an activist throughout the 1960s, both here in St. Louis, but also in various countries in Africa. She lived in Ghana for a while. She lived in Zimbabwe for a bit, and she was an active participant in the Back to Africa movement in the 1960s. We have these collections that we've been trying to integrate, and we're becoming now a collecting museum rather than a wax figure museum. So a lot of these large collections also come with different stories, with various relationships and significant expectations of the type of care we must provide for these items. So they also appear with the histories of our local communities and our neighborhoods, which oftentimes are being destroyed in parts with motivations for urban development projects and things like that. So what I want to show you throughout this talk is basically that small community museums are not just smaller versions, but they are very fundamentally different from larger museums that we've talked about today. And most of the time, they are very important for preserving and understanding African American histories. So usually when we think about museums historically around the world, most of them are built on collecting items that privilege the authority as well as distance from the objects, and really focusing towards on ownership and authority over the objects. Usually the objects are removed from their communities, and they're interpreted by small groups of experts, and they're placed into narratives that usually emphasize singular or universal histories. So for African and African American histories, this has been highly consequential, where there's a lot of loss of cultural connectivity as well as belonging. We also have significant loss of community memory and local histories, where we're not seeing them connected to the everyday material lives. And these materials are usually also overlooked or fragmented and usually separated from the people that created them. So community-based museums emerge in this space where they help us preserve the local histories that are often missing in larger institutional museums. So on the one hand, small museums, especially those built from community archives and through donated materials, operate as living archives. So here you have some pictures of people preserving some materials, creating art, as well as local families and communities who are teaching one another how to use instruments, as well as sharing their own life histories. So through these community archives approach, people are then gaining access to local memories. They are existing in a continuous dialogue. So in this way, our archives are not closed to the community, and they are not just interpreted based on one individual's or a few individuals' elite interpretation, but they are ongoing and continuously evolving alongside the community's interest and the community's focus. Second is that small museums, they allow us for multivocal interpretation. And so what that means is elders, visitors, artists, students, as well as families, they all participate in shaping how stories are told. So they are co-producing the narratives, and these narratives are usually layered. Sometimes they are contested, and they are often richer than what the narratives we get from a single authored perspective. So here you see some of the activities outside of our museum, as well as alongside with different exhibition presentations we've done. And lastly, they are highly important through the construction of, through building trust as well as accessibility to communities. These are spaces where community members feel comfortable contributing their histories and telling their stories. So these are existing in ongoing relationships that we are building with the communities as well as the donors and also other institutions as well. So by creating kind of a middle place between the communities and also other institutions, we lower barriers for participation as well as increase access to more representation of our community members. And so here at the Griot, we offer some of these examples. So the pictures that I've been showing you is pictures from various events that we've been having and allowing us to preserve some of these community histories from a local and multivocal perspectives. So these are preserving African and African American histories where we're having exhibitions through local experiences, as well as maintaining community narratives and creating educational programming. So much of the material culture, which is coming directly from donors whose families have deep ties to St. Louis, and as well as to the broader histories of migration, resistance, contestation, as well as general cultural expressions. And so here I just want to show you a couple of photographs. And these are usually representing both civil rights movement as well as migration. So for example, the photo to the left is taken in Ghana in 1963. And this is, again, sharing about migration histories of Back to Africa movement, but also civil rights movements. And then some of the garments that are donated to us may also reflect social identities, like those of textiles from Ghana, which are, again, part of the Back to Africa movement in the 1960s, and reclaiming the African ancestry and expressions of African identities through textiles. And some of the documents also carry layered histories of struggles and survivals. For example, those of Moses Dixon's documents, who's an abolitionist and whose letter informs us about challenges and victories of free and enslaved African Americans in the early 1900s. So through all of these examples, the griot becomes clear that community members are not just simply audiences. Instead, they are co-producers of historical knowledge. And so from a practical perspective, this also means that the preservation is deeply relational. And so the museum's role extends beyond the conservation of materials to stewardships of memory itself, and they preserve social relationships and historical presence. So I just want to quickly close with a few thoughts. One is that community museums remind us that archives are not supposed to be simply a collection of things. They are networks of trust, care, and responsibility. And they hold stories that live because communities continue to invest in them. They're not just sites of exhibition, but they are infrastructures of cultural continuity. And they make spaces for multiple voices, for histories that might otherwise be invisible, and for communities who themselves, and allows communities to themselves become active participants in preserving the past. Thank you, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much. Yes, if you have any questions for Swaso, please feel free to put those in the Q&A box or the chat feature on YouTube, and we will get to those in a bit. But last but certainly not least, we have Dr. Anissa Malvoisin coming to us. Anissa is Associate Curator of African Art at the Brooklyn Museum and affiliated faculty at the Bard Graduate Center. She holds a Master of Museum Studies and received her PhD from the University of Toronto, specializing in Egyptology, Nubian archaeology, and transculturalism during the first millennium BCE. Her research interests lie in a globalized ancient world through the study of material culture and trade, and from the perspective of African regions. Her scholarship investigates inter and transcultural interactions surrounding the Nile Valley by studying the intersectional biographies of objects. Anissa, feel free to take it away.
Thank you so much, Jasmine. And thank you all for staying till the end. I hope I'll do Hansberry Society justice after all of these amazing presentations right now. Okay, just one moment while I organize my notes. Okay, can everyone see this properly?
Yes.
Great. So I want to start here with sorry, just making my notes a little bit bigger because I can't see. I want to start here with a Suwer painting by Senegalese artist Gora Mbengwe. An important work in the collection at the Brooklyn Museum, Suwer, meaning underglass, or more specifically reverse glass, is a painting technique unique to Senegal originating in the 20th century, where, as the title suggests, the imagery of this work is painted underneath a glass pane in reverse, so applying the foreground before the background. And Benge himself was a member of the Sufi order, among whom this painting technique traveled throughout North Africa through Sufi communities during the 18th century. Therefore, much of the themes of Suer and other reverse glass paintings throughout the Maghreb depict Islamic iconography, such as Aburak, here, the winged horse with an anthropomorphic head, which the Prophet Muhammad flew the Miraj, his nocturnal journey from Mecca to Jerusalem before ascending to heaven, Isra. Beginning with an artwork here that embodies a multifaceted biography, one that highlights technique, faith, and significant cultural attributes, is also a well-defined example of transculturalism, which, along with interculturalism, are frameworks that are the upcoming Arts of Africa galleries at the Brooklyn Museum applies to a collection traditionally treated as singular in scope, contained within artistic and cultural practices that relate best to communities south of the Sahara within a specific time period. So very particularly the European colonial collecting period of the 19th and 20th centuries. And also that frame the African continent as a developmental exception to art history and further world history. Objects indeed often highlight how cultures are affected by each other. And that's where trans and interculturalism come in. The galleries take the latter quite baffling view and shifts it completely, acting as a counter-narrative to hegemonic rhetoric that prioritizes Western Euro-American histories in favor of other histories outside of this dominant imperial perspective. The galleries reframe this traditional representation of primarily historical or tradition-based works from Africa and incumbently center African and diasporic perspectives instead. This includes understanding the continent within this global context, highlighting art movements like Suer, which were not taught in schools, not to the extent of what you're usually taught, which often focuses on dominant communities. For example, the Italian Renaissance. So what's happening in Africa then? How do objects in the collection exemplify this? Or rather, what do their biographies tell us is happening? What is happening in Africa during the Italian Renaissance? What could this portrait from what we think is Northern Italy, likely a product of the Venetian school of the Renaissance period in Europe, tell us about Afro-Euro relations at the time? What of African diasporas in the European Western Mediterranean, like Italy or Andalusia, where significant Amazigan populations lived? Contemporaneously, how were communities in African regions interacting with each other and the world? So these objects from the Congo Kingdom, a powerful Central African entity between the 14th century to the 20th century CE, typify the phenomena of interculturalism, which are the manifestations of geopolitics and cultural interaction. On the left, a memorial figure representing an important individual in Congo society. He's adorned with beaded jewelry, wears an empu, which is a prestige cap, and solemnly smokes his pipe. Cross-legged, he contemplates his place in the universe and represents an indigenous Congo worldview. On the right, a crucifix from the same community signals the onslaught of Christianity in Central Africa and the Congo interpretation of it. There are a finite array of motifs, imagery, and decoration that constitute a unique Congo decorative program on crucifixes from this region at this time that pull on an intercultural thread and localize imagery in their own context through interactions with the Portuguese. A temporal shift in museum galleries as well, and moreover, which considers African art across the longue durée, may offer opportunities to consider these arts as part of a continuous history rather than reinforcing the colonial narrative that treats this material as static, separate, and often outside of global history. Presenting 6th century CE mosaics from a town just out of Carthage in Tunisia, Hamamlif presents them in an African context versus a strictly European one. And everything I'm showing you is part of the broadly the Brooklyn Museum collection, and will be on display in the Arts of Africa galleries opening. So yeah, presenting these in an African context versus a strictly European one, whereas mosaics that align with the Roman period are often taught in this way. They also demonstrate the journey of technology when people journey, though again, localized in context. Some of the best mosaics in the world are in Africa, along the African coast of the Western Mediterranean. So this framework that I've just described developed out of my scholarship on Meroitic ceramics between the mid-4th century BCE to the 4th century CE, which was a comprehensive study of Meroitic decorative programs that appear trans-Sahara, and beyond, contemporaneous to the Meroitic period in Nubia at the same time period. These Meroitic types are so distinctive and specific to this period that it made distinguishing decorative programs at contemporaneous sites outside of Nubia plausible and directly challenged the outdated scholarly attitude of thinking of the Sahara as a barrier, and that long and medium distance trade was unlikely at the time, which I'm glad that since writing and completing my dissertation has significantly changed. Applied more broadly to an entire collection of primarily West, Central, and East African art, and making up hundreds of ethnic groups, an inter and transcultural approach was natural, representative of the object biographies, and built off defended research on a smaller scale with the Meroitic material. Of course, and as we all know, the estrangement of Egyptian and Nubian collections from African art collections continues to permeate the organization of museum departments and cultural classifications. But this will be addressed in the new galleries with an intentional integration of both galleries through this inter and transcultural lens. Returning now to Mbenge, our point of departure, inter and transcultural approaches seek to frame African art in novel ways. This lecture offered pathways to acknowledge coloniality in museums by briefly touching upon existing curatorial practices and collections management of institutional holdings, while also offering diverse ways to engage with material from the African continent, which center object biographies and trans-regional relationships. That is, the creation of what I refer to as an intersectional biography. It is also within the context of these analyses that I suggest a pre-colonial temporal expansion for the presentation of African art in museum displays, one that includes a historically accurate survey of African art beyond the legacy of upholding the ideals of the Euro-American colonial collecting period that I mentioned earlier, 19th and 20th centuries, and rightfully situates creative outputs from Africa within regional and global contexts. As I delineate inter and transcultural theory and drawing from object biographies, intersectional biographies consider the inter and transcultural intersections that an object exists within. They're multimodal, so it could be technology, could be surface treatment, could be faith, and specific to one object. However, they may also uniquely connect to multiple objects through a common juncture. That could be colonialism, imperialism, or trade, for example. They are considered within a larger historical context rather than a supremely localized social life. Intersectional biographies do not compete with object biographies, rather they are a singularization of an innate feature of a biography applied to objects and can and should be understood alongside object biographies. This type of framework is especially applicable to museum collections and objects as a direct opposition to systematization based on colonial rhetoric, something that my fellow panelists have been bringing up throughout this seminar today. Each object that I've shown you today elucidates this decolonial approach. Here, I'm using Meroitic pottery as a point of departure because that's what I do, but we're focusing here on the Greco-Roman features that connects Meroitic decorative programs to the Greek and Roman worlds via ceramic technology and also decorative distinctions, and thus to more than one historical narrative that is ultimately intercultural and sometimes transcultural. Further, it links to more than one museum collection, disrupting museum silos towards an improved interdisciplinary syncretism. By understanding an object's intersectional biography, it is possible to consistently and clearly broaden the historical representation of objects that are often relegated to being organized into a singular, colonially classified collection. In reality, many collections are interrelated, especially in an encyclopedic museum. And this is kind of this is where I did all of my research, and also this is the context within which I work. This approach is a type of epistemic disobedience, in Walter Mignolo's metamorphic words, that unsettles colonial classifications and takes collections to a point of relative transformation that rather discusses historical truths from a, quote, different beginning, from the point of view of people and objects instead of the colonial beginning. The latter would be unbound by early classification methods and represented in situ For example, it is possible to locate objects made by artists from African regions and its global diaspora in the current organization of museum departments like ancient Egypt, contemporary art, Islamic art, to name a few. And then this is a further connection to works from different regions, but that connect to a common juncture. So I'm just elucidating the intersectional biography framework that I came up with that shows how these objects are connected and how the biographies are connected. So here on the bottom right is a Chadian cup with the lotus, with a lotus motif, excuse me, and also cross-hatching decoration with the exact same program on a contemporaneous vessel from a site in Nubia, Faras. Meretic finewares are an example of materials with intersectional biographies, and thus both disrupt erroneous interpretations on Nubian history, while also expanding the understanding of Nubian materials within strictly Egyptological collections. So along with understanding inter and transcultural relationships through object biographies, it also will be crucial to collaborate. So from the perspectives of people, community comment, collaboration, and co-creation, there may exist power shifts over who constructs narratives around the object and provides space to explore broader social biographies through reinterpretation, excuse me, and new understandings within the museum by descendant communities. So I'll stop there and thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to speaking about this further.
Thank you so much, Anissa. I will invite the other panelists to join us on camera if you can. We are ahead of schedule, so we have plenty of time for questions. If people have any, there's already a bunch in the chat, so I'll get to those, but feel free to put any questions you have in the Q&A box or the chat feature on YouTube. Okay. So the first one is for me. Can you talk about the reasons behind the move of the Karga Oasis records from the Egyptian department to the medieval art department? Do you think the move helped or hindered access to the archive, or maybe did not impact access at all? That's a great question. Thank you. Vanessa, I don't know the exact reason of the move of the cargo material. Um, I think one of the things that's mentioned in the finding aid is that they decided to move some of the later Egyptian material out of the Egyptian department. And so this again goes to that thing of kind of what, like why museum departments are separated in the way that they are. You know, the Met has Egyptian material in several different departments, Egyptian, medieval, Islamic, it's all across the museum. And so thinking about who's making those decisions and why is definitely something to consider. Um, do I think the move helped or hindered access? That's a good question. I've been thinking about that too. In some ways, I don't think it was hindered at all by moving to medieval um because I think that again, like with priorities, the medieval department has made this collection a priority. Just to have so many images online is kind of a big deal. I don't really see any other collections, archaeological collections that have that many photographs for one put online, let alone the other correspondence that's been digitized and scanned between medieval and the library. So definitely not a hindrance. So yeah, I think it goes like back again to priorities of departments and priorities of curators as well, and collections managers. Um, So in some ways, I would think it was probably helpful for it to be in that department. Um, the Egyptian department does have, I think, an article that links the Karga archives to the other Egyptian expedition archives that the Met has. So both are kind of showing that this is work that's been done in the museum. But I do think that the medieval art department has been helpful in making sure that so much of that material is available already. Um, there's a question for Sydney. This has been answered already. Did you do that, Sydney? Okay.
I pressed it on accident, but I have the one about the earrings.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So yes, men, as we understand it, men and women, both wore the big hoop earrings. That image that I had in my presentation was a male. Um, we see a lot from like Kerma adornment and also like C group adornment practices. They like often have these very large stone earrings, sometimes also bone, or yeah, mostly stone or bone. And they either are like hoops, like mine, but bigger, or sometimes kind of like gauge kind of things, or there's like ear studs, so you can see the actual like hole getting bigger. Um, yeah, and I think um, Shayla Monroe actually talks a lot about um, uh, these adornment practices and like coming into the Nile Valley and being like super drippy, and that being a thing that not separated, but that really made ancient Nubian, early ancient Nubian cultures, particularly C group, like super distinctive because they were relating both their oh hey Shayla in the audience, relating both their uh connection to how they're adorning themselves, or also to their relationship with cattle. Um, which I'm just I'm thinking about it too. The objects in the IEA collection don't necessarily lend itself to talk about the Nubian affinity towards like the cattle culture, but I really would love to be able to include that somewhere in there because it was such an important part in how they saw themselves. But yeah, adornment being a very much a thing is not it wasn't particularly gendered because both men and women would be highly adorned, wearing beads, earrings, bracelets, you name it.
Awesome. And that question, just for the audience, was did the men in Nubia also wear big looping earrings? Um, and that is the question that Sydney just answered. There is one for, I believe, Anissa. Is this Congo cross artwork from the 17th century? Does the Kakongo cosmogram symbolism merge with the African Jesus to suggest a specific set of spiritual revelations or initiatic experiences experienced by Congo initiates?
I'm not sure. I mean, this particular cross um, is like decoratively, distinctively Congo. Like it has very particular like decorative traits that um, are that I guess like Congo artisans and those who adopted Christianity thought were important to kind of adorn the cross. I don't know though if like um, those particular decorative traits exemplify uh, the what the question what the question asks. And I don't think so, but that's something that I would have to research. So I don't want to give a definite answer. But it's interesting because these crosses are unique. They're localized within context, within Angola and the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and differ from crosses from Europe. So you can tell when they're um, you can differentiate which ones are Congo crosses and which ones aren't.
Awesome. Question from Dr. Shayla Monroe. Do you know what site in Chad produced the lotus jar?
Yes, the site's called Korotoro in Borku region. Koro-Toro. Very close to Nubia. It's like very close. It's on the eastern side, Chad.
Okay, let me give you another one really quick. Anissa, could you distinguish between intercultural and transcultural understanding in the context of your work?
Yeah, so intercultural is more when one culture adopts and then localizes, and transcultural is when there's a sharing of both. And you can see that there's adoptions on both sides of a cultural interaction. So I don't always want to say transcultural because there isn't always a transcultural manifestation. Sometimes it is just like an object is just showing us what happens when people are talking to each other, but on one side, and some traits are not adopted on the other side. Um, and I think that in most cases, there are transcultural instances or circumstances. Like we could also talk about um, Congo, or they're actually Vili, but they're Central African ivories that you also find in West Africa that were um, made for European merchants and kind of commissioned for European merchants as well, brought back to Europe. And then you have like very similar types of, they're called olifants. They're like, yeah, they're those long, it looks like a elephant tusk kind of in, but you can blow into them. Um, but then they're making them in Europe as well. So I would say that's like a transcultural interaction. But I didn't say that for the particular Congo material that I showed because those are very, I think, explicitly intercultural. But yeah, I'll stop talking. Sorry. Thanks.
Awesome. Okay. Fantastic. So also there's a couple for you. In this photograph is Anne Malone standing at the W.E.B. Du Bois burial ground in Ghana.
Yes.
Perfect. There was another one. Oh, yes. Are there things about the way smaller community-based museums operate that might be adopted by larger museums that can better center Africanness and lived experiences of the public?
I think just ongoing incorporation of the community into every stage of the inventory, the cataloging, describing the materials, even interpreting the materials. So making sure that community are openly invited and resources are available to make sure that they are included and able to participate to the fullest extent. And that their ideals and their concepts are being taken seriously and incorporated. I think those are the main things that larger institutes should be able to incorporate and adopt from small museums.
Awesome. Thank you. Another one for you. How do you call community to feel comfortable to contribute to the collection? What does your outreach look like?
So a lot of it is because of the relationships that we've built with the community rather than making calls to the community. So we usually don't invite communities, hey, like donate your items. Usually we have relationships with the communities. They volunteer with us. We volunteer with them. They visit the museum, and over time, and they also participate in different art, creation activities or musical activities that we host. And over time, they build that trust with us. And then they decide, I want to get rid of this item, but I don't want to get rid of it. I don't want it to end up in the trash, and I trust y'all to protect it. So they end up donating it to us. But we don't actually actively look for people to donate to us. We don't actually invite people to donate to us. They choose to donate it to us. And it was never our intention to become a collection museum. We became a collection museum because people had that trust in us and provided us their materials.
Awesome. Anissa, there's a question that says, and maybe even for Sydney too, has there been any impact on your museum collections of African countries requesting the return of their artifacts?
We've actually before my time, we did repatriate some objects to Mali. But during my time, no,
And not
but
that
we're
I'm,
relationship building still. Sorry, go ahead.
oh, sorry. Not that I'm aware of on our side, but that I can't answer that definitively. That would be a question that I'll have to talk to the curator about.
Some a question for you, Sydney. Um, how do scholars get beyond the limitations of Reisner's Nubian Convention that is loosely applied and move towards an integrative integrative approach of continuity between the North and the South?
Okay. I think just trying to, like I talked about in the talk, to poke holes in those distinctions, um, and highlighting where the continuity is. With the state of like most collections, it is hard to think about where, like you mentioned, where things are housed or how they're collected, things like that. It makes it a little bit difficult. But when you have the opportunity to be the one that's controlling the narrative, then you can sprinkle it in a little bit more and like note where the transmissions are, where the exchanges are. I really, really, really like Anissa's approach, talking about intersectional biographies and transcultural biographies, and I will be adopting that. So thank you, Anissa. Um, and just thinking about that, or like maybe trying to use that framework to develop the interpretive panels and stuff inside of a museum space. As far as actually also even to moving the objects in space together as well. Like I mentioned, what I'm trying to do with the Now Valley religion. Um, we'll see if they let me do it and put them all together as opposed to keeping separate. Um, yeah, I think it's just a continual effort to just try to like push for the changes and push for the way that like at least as I understand it, the scholarship is changing and shifting to acknowledge those things more, but our museum what do you call it? Practices don't always reflect that. And I think it's really important for the museum spaces to reflect the change of the scholarship. And I wanted to try to highlight that in my presentation because that is where the public is connecting to this research and to this information. They're not looking to the academic papers. They're not looking at our presentations, right? And so, I mean, some might, but for the most part, they're not. And so the museums are that first space of interaction with this information. And so it's our responsibility then to kind of make sure that we're presenting the information in a way that is most up to date, basically. I said a lot to say a little to say we working on it. Okay.
Okay, another question that's kind of open. So anyone can feel free to tackle this, especially Anissa, Sydney. Um, there's still a divide and separation between Tassedi and Tawi Egypt from the earliest writing period. Tassedi written on the Siali palette, clear writing. The other problem is that there are light red dark Nubians and dark red light Egyptians. Museums still separate the peoples. Your thoughts from all the panelists on fixing the peopling issue? The Brooklyn Museum's panels challenge this. What more can we do? Um,
I think it's more of the same, like highlighting those integrative approaches and the biographies of the objects and how they're all connected. Um, and acknowledging that these are spaces that are like multi-linguistic, multi-ethnic, multi-cultural. And so a very static picture that might have been presented in the earlier periods is no longer accepted. And so kind of expanding and exploding that previous mold and just making space for greater diversity.
awesome. Anissa, Is the link between Meroitic and West and Central African ceramics due to trade between the cultures or due to descent from a common ancestral culture?
Um, I look at it from a trade perspective or just people moving around. And it doesn't even have to be trade, it could be just migration or travel, anything like that. Because I'm seeing it happening contemporaneously. So it's within a specific time period. And I haven't done comparative studies in other time periods. I focus generally on the first millennium, the mid first millennium to the mid BCE to the mid first millennium CE, which is a long period of time. But I haven't gone uh, back as much. But I mean, I think that all of our training in Egyptology and Nubian archaeology, we've seen some of these kind of early connections, especially between Egypt and Nubia, um, and other kind of like Western desert entities. But I don't want to speak too much on that just because that's not where my research has brought me or focused too much on. Um, so I think that it's particularly within the Meroitic period, um, people moving around. And also because I say people moving around because evidence of trade of ceramics is not always as clear, even though the decorative programs are extremely clear. So and so the localization of the decorative program, I think, makes more sense if someone has seen it or is engaged with like a potter or have seen the object, and then decides to make it within their local context. So that's why those two pots I showed look similar, but they're not. It's going to be different fabric. It's going to be kind of like a different vessel shape or morphology. So yeah, that's what I would say. But I think that more research can be done, and it's just the beginning.
Awesome. A question about the Congo cross. What do the four people on the edge of the Congo cross represent? Are they the four disciples, or are they saints from Congo? Or perhaps are the four people on the edge of the cross allusions to Congo divinities?
Um, I believe that they're saints and very, very connected to Christianity. I don't think that this particular cross represents particular like individuals or um, imagery relational to Congo, I guess indigenous spirituality. But again, my study of Congo crosses is just at its beginning. It's just at its genesis. So I do know that this is very, very, very closely related to like Christian faith and Christian imagery, and not um, like indigenous Congo spirituality. But take that with a grain of salt as I continue to research.
Awesome. Another question for I think any of us. As museums, particularly in the US, tie ancient Egypt to an African context, and given what seems like the current climate from Egypt, modern Egyptians themselves, is there significant pushback from the academy in Egypt against lumping the two? What are your responses when experiencing this phenomenon? I'll jump in for a hot sec. Y'all correct me if I'm wrong. I don't think there's significant pushback, at least in the US. But somebody can jump in on that.
So, yeah, I haven't gotten pushback in within I can only talk about like my museum context. I'm actually like gotten extreme encouragement to like really ground the objects within the African context, and but also, and at the same time to acknowledge like all of the other interconnections that are happening with the rest of the world as well. And so, like I mentioned, that early map, the biggest critique is that like you can't see anything except for that one area where you can see the bodies of water nearby, but you can't see the like the land masses where people are engaging with and stuff. And so um I am encouraged um to talk about that African context. That may not be the case in all museum spaces, but I just know that in terms of the IEA and the direction that we're going, there has been support from the academic side there, which is nice, because I know that wasn't always the case historically.
There are a couple questions about books. Do you recommend any particular books for understanding hieratic script from ancient Egypt written on objects?
Not me personally, because I haven't even learned hieratic yet. I'm still in my introductory Middle Egyptian coursework. But if anyone else has any recommendations, do let the people know.
Sounds like a Solange Ashby question.
Yeah.
Solange said, I believe Foy Scalf at the OI teaches hieratic online. Fantastic. Another question. I was just wondering if anyone on the panel is aware of the new General History of Africa, Volume 9, and if so, what is the panel's thoughts? Um,
I'll check it out.
Same. Um, okay. There's a question about the Smithsonian. I don't know if any of us can answer this. Why does the Smithsonian continue to place Egyptian artifacts into the Asian Museum rather than the African Museum? How can this be challenged so that they change this problem? Or is there nothing that can be done about this issue?
Can you say the question again?
Yes. Why does the Smithsonian continue to place Egyptian artifacts into the Asian Museum rather than the African Museum? How can this be challenged so that they change this problem? Or is there nothing that can be done about the issue?
I cannot speak to that.
I didn't know about the Asian Museum. I think the only um, Egyptian. Wait, go ahead.
Yeah, I was only aware of objects in the Natural History Museum.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say. Um, oh, I think someone said that Vanessa Davies and the Now Valley Collective have been trying for years to have this changed. Nothing has moved yet, unfortunately.
Mm.
Um, Deborah also put in the chat that the question about hieroglyphs, Mario Beatty teaches Medu Necher and just started teaching Coptic at the K-Nubia platform. Um, could you put that link? Could you send that link to everyone? The right now it's just to host and panelists. Um, Thank you. Okay, I think again, if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A. I think the questions from YouTube are being put over. Am I missing anything, y'all? Okay. I think, how are we feeling? Ah,
Oh, good.
well, I'm not seeing a whole lot. I'm seeing a whole lot of thank yous. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you to Miss Gail Hansberry um, for being here today to celebrate her father with us. We really appreciate you being here. We appreciate again the sponsors for your support and helping us put this together, and for everyone who spent a couple hours of their Saturday. We really appreciate that as well. The recording of this we made available later. Um, yeah. Anything else that anyone needs to add? Or are we all set? Cool. Thank you all again. Stay safe, especially if you're on the East Coast. We have a blizzard coming. Stay warm.
Take care, everyone. Thank you.
Well, thank you so